From the book Snow Angels by Harriet Loveday, Enchanted Escape. Joe had moved into the little alpine chalet with his parents when he was 8. From the moment he joined school, he and Louis were inseparable. Joe loved going to school, not that he was particularly bothered by learning and schooling, but because he got to spend all day in the presence of his best friend, the one person who understood him and made time for him above all others, intelligent, exuberant Louis. As they grew older, their friendship stood firm. Joe was the stable one, mild-mannered, careful, diligent, measured. He had brown hair, brown eyes, and a nondescript average face that matched his personality. Louis had white blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, sharp features, and all the crazy ideas, like making go-karts and racing them down the hill in the village as fast as they could, or going up into the hills and creating dens and secret hideaways camouflaged with tree branches. Joe and Louis lived for their time together, and it was always fun. Both Joe and Louis's parents commented on their inseparable bond, shook their heads, and wondered how two such different people never grew tired of each other. But Joe and Louis's friendship stood firm. More than that, their compounded memories and shared experiences bound them together through the passage of time. In the chaos of the world, the duo knew that they could always depend on each other, and even if no one else believed them, they would always believe in each other. That was why, despite all reason, when Louis came back from the woods one day and said he'd seen fairies, Joe didn't tell him that such things didn't scientifically exist or to stop making up stories. Rather, they sat together quietly on the swing seat at the end of Louis's parents' balcony, overlooking the summer valley below, while Joe listened and Louis explained. "I went up into the woods to pick wild strawberries for Mum," Louis explained. "I found a new secret spot, a little clearing. It's quite high up. I don't think many people go there." Joe nodded, listening intently to his friend. "Is it far to walk?" Joe asked. "Not too far. I think we should go. I want to show you," Louis said. "You don't think it was a fleeting thing and that the fairies will move on?" asked Joe. "No, the trees all around the clearing were different too, with funny twists and holes. I think it might be a fairy settlement, where they live. I don't know why I didn't see it before," said Louis. "Perhaps it's enchanted. Perhaps they wanted you to see it," reasoned Joe. The friends exchanged glances and Louis looked at his feet. Louis asked, "But why now? Why do they want to show me this now?" Louis raised his eyes to the concerned eyes of his friend. Joe replied, "I don't know, Louis, but I agree. I do think we should go back and check it out again together." Louis nodded, relieved. Joe was practical and sensible. Joe would sort it all out. Perhaps he'd had too much sun or not enough water to drink. Perhaps it'd all been in his head. Perhaps. "Why don't we go camping?" Joe suggested. "You're not afraid?" Louis asked. "Hey, I thought you were supposed to be the adventurous one." Winking at Louis, Joe said, "I'm not afraid." Joe held out his hand on his lap, and Louis clasped it, just like they were 8 again, running around the playground holding hands and playing tag. The two friends sat on the swing chair, with the comforting touch of each other that only a reassuring handhold can give. "Thanks, Joe," Louis said, looking down onto the valley. They decided to camp. As they were nearly 16, Louis's parents had agreed, and it was only a matter of persuasion to get Joe's parents to agree too. Besides, it was summer and a quiet alpine village. What was the worst that could happen? Joe and Louis had great fun unpacking their camping gear next to a very quiet and beautifully green clearing. The trees did look a little twisted, but Joe couldn't see much more than that. They had a small camping stove and tins of beans to cook in the pan, matches for the campfire, a torch, and sleeping bags for their 2-man tent. Both boys had also charged their phones, not only so that their parents could call them and check they were okay, but also to take videos and photos of the fairies when they came. Hopefully that night, although, as Joe reasoned to Louis, they may have moved on. Perhaps they were travelling fairies. Joe and Louis sat out by the campfire and looked out into the night. The stars above them were bright and clear. The moon hung in a little crescent and glowed softly cream. All around them the trees whispered and shuffled. Even if they didn't see fairies tonight, everything around them seemed enchanted, and that was almost enough to feed their imaginations. Waiting until at least midnight, the boys watched the clearing carefully and chatted quietly. Deciding that the fairies had probably moved on, they put out the fire and snuggled up in the tent to get a little rest before the sun rose. It was quiet, dark and still when Louis gently shook Joe awake. Placing his finger over Joe's mouth so that he didn't speak, Louis gently tugged at Joe over to the tent door. Both the boys' heads touched together at the bottom of the opening of the tent. Looking out, they saw the most wondrous, incredible sight. In the middle of the clearing, not more than 20 metres away, the space was alive with fairies. The clearing was lit by tiny lights in multicolours and little dancing people, only they didn't quite look like people due to their thin, spindly arms, very small size, and the addition of wings on their backs. There were so many different types of fairies too. Some were spindly and brown like twigs, some were green and spiky like the fir trees, and still others were as soft as the breeze, almost as if they were made from the air. It was true then, there were fairies. Joe and Louis watched what seemed to be some kind of fairy gathering or fairy party. There was certainly a lot of dancing going on. Some fairies had taken the party to the air and were zipping around. Some were eating little wild strawberries while sat at miniature tables. In their eagerness to eat, they were standing on the table or each other and dripping strawberry juice on their neighbours' heads. Amongst the fairies, one stood out. She was slightly taller than the others. Her gown was longer and appeared to be made of summer alpine flowers, and on her head she wore a twisted crown, almost like twigs of gold encircling her head and protruding upwards from her long brown hair. From the crown fell little glass droplets that looked like little droplets of dew. Some of the fairies around her were bowing or kneeling, however most were trying to gain her attention. One bold fairy invited her to dance. It was the most beautiful thing the friends had ever seen. Without saying a word, the boys lay side by side, watching every enchanted moment. Joe couldn't remember when he'd fallen asleep, but he awoke to the fresh morning air rolling over himself and Louis, where they lay side by side, their heads together at the entrance of the tent, Louis's protective arm draped over Joe. Joe tried to stir without waking Louis and looked out at the empty clearing before them. They had seen it, hadn't they? It wasn't a figment of their imagination. Louis stirred next to Joe. He pulled his arm off his friend's shoulders and looked around disorientated until he remembered where they were, and looking at Joe, gave him a half smile. "You saw it too?" he asked. Joe nodded to his friend in confirmation. "Yes, I saw it," he said, then added, "Completely nuts, though." Joe ran his fingers over his lips, contemplating. Louis waited, knowing that his friend had something important to say. Eventually Joe said, "Louis, I've seen it too. It is real. We did see fairies, but I don't think we should say anything to anyone else, not the other students at school or our parents. I just don't think they'd believe us." Louis followed his friend's thinking. "Not a problem, Joe. Let's just keep it to ourselves." Achy standing up from their bumpy ground mattress, the boys emerged from the tent and stumbled around outside. Louis wanted to start the camping stove to make some tea and breakfast, but Joe wanted to investigate the clearing, and eventually Louis was persuaded to go with him. There was a strange atmosphere, almost as if they were being watched, but looking around the boys could see that they were the only ones in this part of the forest. Certainly they couldn't see or hear other people. Joe and Louis had a thorough search of the trees and the rabbit holes, amongst the grass and under the logs, but they couldn't find anything. They were just about to return to the tent when Joe cried out to Louis, "Stop! Don't put your foot down." Louis obediently held his foot mid-step, while Joe dropped to his knees and, from under the sole of Louis's trainers, rescued a tiny little spiky gold ring, about the size of a thimble. He placed it in his palm for them both to inspect. It wasn't a ring. It was a small, twisted gold crown with delicate glass droplets as fine as the dew. Joe looked around and said, "Little fairies, I have your queen's crown." Everything stopped. The air stood still. The breeze didn't move. Birds stood motionless on their branches. The songs halted while exiting their mouths. The clearing separated from reality and became its own bubble. There, before the boys, stood the queen of the fairies, Freya. Queen Freya was dressed in a gown of silk and cobwebs, and drops of dew adorned her brown hair. Her face had fine features and she had grey eyes. Despite being so small, she was as gracious and magnanimous as any human queen. Joe and Louis fell to their knees before her, and Joe held out his hand with the little crown resting carefully in the palm. "Queen of the Fairies, I have found your crown," Joe said. He averted his eyes as she came towards them. "You may look upon me," she said. Both boys raised their eyes. "My name is Queen Freya." She paused. "You have done me a great service, Joe. I thank you. The fairies will always recognise you both as friends." She reached forward and lifted her tiny crown from Joe's hand and placed it on her head. Then she continued, "For your recognition of honesty, Joe, you will be granted the gift of joining us if you ever should choose. But I warn you, we live an enchanted life. If you join us," and in so saying she indicated around her to the fairies that had gathered at the edge of the clearing and who were clamouring over each other in fascination and fear of the two boys, "then you may never return to your world, for once you enter the kingdom of the fairies, there is no return." What a strange thank you, Joe thought, but he was sensible and recognised it was a kind offer and that Queen Freya was likely quite powerful, so he carefully replied, "Thank you, Queen Freya, I am honoured." The world took a breath and started again. The clearing was as it was before, nothing remarkable except a few twisted trees and a patch of vivid green grass. Joe and Louis turned to each other, their eyes locked in their secret. Without saying a word, they each knew that they must keep this to themselves. With the return to school at the end of the summer, the weather turned, and so did Joe and Louis' fate, none of it for the better. Not only was it the last year before their exams, but a new kid had joined from the city, and he was really, really unpleasant. Most of Joe and Louis' friends recognised and respected their deep friendship. Just as cones belong to pine trees, everyone accepted Joe and Louis as belonging together. It was perfectly natural and nothing strange. However, Tom, the new boy, was a spiteful troublemaker who liked to believe he was incredibly intelligent and important, and to cover that he wasn't, instead had become a horrible bully. Or worse, there were rumours. Tom had had to leave the city rather quickly. His parents had whisked him away, and this was not the first time. Tom started the school innocently enough, charming the teachers and wooing the girls, while trying to impress the boys, telling them that he stood by his word and that he was a boy of honour and loyalty. But nothing could be further from the truth. It wasn't long before his true colours started to show. Noticing Joe and Louis were so close, Tom decided to play games on them. This was little more than a reaction to his own jealousy that he had never had a real friendship and he was incapable of feeling love. Rather than reflecting on why, Tom accosted Louis in the corridor and said, "I heard Joe say that you were stupid. He pretends to you that you're not, but he has to correct your homework and everyone knows." Louis shrugged Tom off and walked away in the opposite direction. Tom tried his luck on Joe. Running in next to Joe after sports, Tom said, "Louis told me you were so boring. You never do anything exciting. I can't think why he'd say that about you. Can you?" Joe ignored Tom. But Tom hadn't finished yet. He wanted his emotional reaction. He wanted to split their friendship and make them feel pain, because pain was the only emotion Tom was able to feel. Changing tactic, he singled them out in class, saying aloud to their classmates, "Don't you think it's odd how they always sit together?" Or, "I saw them whispering really close." Or, "Most boys I know are interested in girls, not boys." Eventually, a girl at the back of the class told Tom to shut up, but this just burnt his ego and pushed him further. Tom watched Joe and Louis incessantly. It was tough for the boys to be constantly under his glare. One day in mid-December, just before they were about to break for Christmas, and Louis shouldn't have done it, but he just needed reassurance from Joe after a particularly nasty session of catcalling from Tom, Louis brushed the back of Joe's hand as they left the class and said in a low voice just between them, "Fairies." It was Louis's way of feeling that they had a bond and a secret that was unbreakable, despite Tom's bullying. Louis didn't know, but Tom had seen, and he had heard. Tom took Joe and Louis's bus back from the school that day. He was a menacing black presence at the back of the bus. The boys tried to ignore him as they sat together and watched the snow-covered slopes while the bus slowly wound its way up the road to their home. When the bus reached the little alpine village, all the remaining children alighted, including Tom. Joe and Louis started to make their way home. Joe and Louis could feel Tom behind them, like an evil dark cloud, so desperate to belong, so detached from real human love, that he had to take away others' pleasure and feed off their pain in a triumphant display of dominance. Because Tom's cup could never be full, he repeated the cycle everywhere he went. 5 schools now, and worse. Joe and Louis hunched over together and whispered in low tones as they pulled their puffy jackets tighter and held the straps of their rucksacks. Thump! A snowball came hurtling through the air and hit Louis on the back of the head. Joe turned around angrily to Tom, not more than 5 meters behind them, and said, "Cut it out. Go home, Tom. You are not wanted here." Tom raised his arm in anger and took aim again, only this time it wasn't a snowball. It was a rock. Joe ducked and the rock narrowly missed his head, shattering a car window behind him. Louis's eyes were wide with fear. He grabbed Joe's jacket and shouted, "Run!" Run the boys did. Up the road, past the gate, up the lane. Ahead of them stood Louis's parents' chalet. His parents wouldn't be home for at least another half an hour, and Louis didn't think he could get the key out in time, so the boys kept running, up, into the alpine woods that they knew so well. Behind them, Tom followed, his eyes wide and thirsty for the hunt. They were high in the tree line now. The snow was thick and deep. Joe would have run forever, but Louis tripped, slipped, and fell a little way. "Louis!" Joe called, and immediately ran to the aid of his friend, but not before Tom got to him first. Clutching at Louis's beautiful white blonde hair, Tom dragged him up by it and pinned him against a tree. Louis had a little trickle of blood down the side of his face and cried out in pain as Tom dropped a fistful of hair onto the crisp white snow. Joe picked up a stick and directly faced Tom, not more than a few meters away. Tom had his arm over Louis's neck. In his other hand he held a large steel hunting knife. "Joe, no!" Louis called from his captivity, his eyes straining in fear to protect his friend. "Now isn't this interesting?" Tom salivated, his black, soulless eyes drunk on their fear. 2 little fairies in a woodland. Joe measured the weight of the stick in his hand and made his calculations. Tom continued, "So you have a choice, Joe. Say you love Louis and I might let him go. Say you don't and I'll slit his silly little white throat. It isn't the first time." The words hung like poison in the air. The boys had no doubt that Tom was capable of killing. They knew that they would never have any peace. The ultimatum meant nothing. It was a baseless sham. Very likely someone was about to get hurt or worse. This was just a twisted game to Tom. Louis also knew that Joe would never denounce him. Joe and Louis's eyes connected. Louis knew. Louis opened his mouth as if to say, "Freya," said Joe. Time stopped. The breeze stopped. The snow stopped falling. Everyone and everything was still, except Joe and Freya, Queen of the Fairies. Queen Freya stood before him in a gown of fluffy soft snow. On her head was a crown of pure ice, shaped like little icicles dripping up into the heavens. "Joe," she said. Joe dropped to the ground before her. "Queen Freya, you once made me an offer. You once said to me that I was a friend to the fairies. I need your friendship now. You once said to me that I could come join you in the enchanted fairy kingdom. Dear Queen Freya, could Louis and I come join you now?" "You can, but the invitation was only for you, Joe, not Louis." Queen Freya looked a little sad. "May I?" Joe said. He reached out his hand to her tiny one and placed her hand on his heart. "Louis is my only love. I cannot live a life without him. I beg you, my generous queen, feel my heart. Show us pity." A small tear escaped from Queen Freya's eyes as she felt his warm heart only moments away from breaking and stopping forever. "Very well," she said, "but this will be for eternity. You will never be able to go back." "I would rather spend an eternity with my only love, caught in your enchanted kingdom than a lifetime in this lonely world without him. I am sure, Joe said. Go gather your friend, carry him with you, and follow me, Queen Freya commanded. Joe stood and carefully navigated his way through the snow to where Louis and Tom's motionless bodies stood. Tom's black eyes were boring into Louis's terrified cry to Joe. Joe shivered in the presence of pure evil. Gently lifting the knife blade and arm back from Louis's neck, Joe slid Louis out, lifted him heavily over his shoulder, and stumbled back to where the fairy queen and her growing entourage stood. Follow me, she commanded. The entourage started to move up the hill, some flying, some walking, all in hushed tones. Taking one last glance behind him, Joe saw the shadow of Louis's body on the snow. Red blood splattered around him, Tom's mouth open in some kind of bloodthirsty war cry. Joe's almost shape still standing with a stick in his hand. But it wasn't really Joe and Louis, because they had gone. Up, up, up the hill. Louis's weight was heavy, and Joe struggled and strained through the snow. But as he walked, little fairies came to his aid, flying all around him and holding parts of Louis's clothing. After what seemed like a long, long time, they finally reached the clearing. No longer green and lush, no longer dotted by wild strawberries and alpine flowers, but covered in snow. Gently dropping Louis to the centre of the clearing, Joe fell down exhausted beside him, cradling Louis's head on his lap. Joe felt the world breathe again. Just like a watercolour being painted, the world around Joe started to fill in. It was wondrous. The snow sparkled like glitter. The trees were lit with little multicoloured lights. Tiny fairy homes dotted the trees, and they were connected by little walkways and little ladders from the homes that fell to the ground. There were fairies dancing and singing. Fairies were flying around them and touching Joe and Louis in wonder. Queen Freya pointed to a particularly large tree a little way back from the clearing, with a huge hole at its base. In many ways it reminded Joe of the opening to their tent this summer just gone, a lifetime ago. You can live there, she said. It may not look like much, but remember our homes are magical, and we are not bound by space and time. Once you descend the stairs, I think you will find it more than comfortable. Looking up at Joe, she said, Now, Joe, you must wake your friend. But how? Asked Joe, cradling Louis in his arms. Please tell me how. You wake him with true love's kiss, Queen Freya replied. Joe tenderly leant over his friend and kissed him awake.